What happens when a routine day at a Texas border post turns into a deadly siege, with a Delta Force veteran caught between saving innocent families and facing the darkest cartels in Mexico? As gunfire erupts and a mother's desperate cry echoes through the chaos, Commander Jack Sullivan must make a choice that could either save lives or ignite a bloodbath that changes everything. Will he outsmart the enemy, or will his own secrets tear it all apart? Hit that subscribe button and join us on the road to 1,000 subscribers to uncover the shocking truth in this heart-pounding tale. The morning sun cast a golden haze over the El Paso border facility, its rays glinting off the barbed wire atop the perimeter fence like a warning written in fire. Jack "Hawk" Sullivan, a 25-year Delta Force veteran turned ICE commander, strode along the dusty path with a steady gait, his worn boots crunching against the gravel, a sound that echoed memories of battlefields far from this arid stretch of Texas dirt. Now, 48 with flecks of gray creeping into his close-cropped hair, Jack had traded the chaos of war for a badge, believing he could do more good protecting the legal dreams of families crossing into America than chasing shadows in foreign lands. But as his sharp blue eyes scanned the shimmering heat waves distorting the Mexican landscape in the distance, a familiar unease settled into his gut, a soldier's instinct that whispered today would be anything but routine. Inside the facility's processing center, the air hummed with quiet purpose. Rows of families sat at metal desks, their voices a soft murmur as they handed over worn documents to uniformed officers. Among them was Miguel Hernandez, a wiry man in his late 30s with a teacher's gentle demeanor, his calloused hand clutching a small bracelet engraved with the name Clara. Beside him, his 7-year-old daughter Sophia doodled on a scrap of paper, her dark curls bouncing as she hummed a tune. Miguel's eyes darted nervously around the room, though he forced a smile for Sophia's sake. There was a story behind that bracelet. Jack could see it in the way Miguel's fingers trembled slightly as he touched it, but now wasn't the time to ask. Not when his instincts screamed that trouble was brewing just beyond the horizon. Jack's radio crackled to life as he reached the eastern perimeter, pulling him from his thoughts. "Commander Sullivan, this is Sarah Martinez," came the voice of his deputy, crisp and urgent despite the early hour. "We've got reports of unusual activity overnight. 3 vehicles with tinted windows crossing at irregular points south of Sector 5, not the usual smuggling routes." Sarah's tone carried a weight Jack recognized, suspicion tempered by caution. He'd been his right hand for 3 years, a former Border Patrol officer with a knack for spotting patterns where others saw noise. "Copy that," Jack replied, his voice steady but his mind already racing through possibilities. "Could be a diversion, or they're testing new paths. Get Ethan Brooks on it, see what the thermal scans show." Ethan, their tech specialist, had a way with surveillance systems that bordered on sorcery, and if anyone could spot a hidden threat in the data, it was him. Jack adjusted the badge on his chest, its weight a different kind of burden than the medals he'd once worn, and turned his gaze back to the horizon. The heat waves rippled like a mirage, but he knew better than to trust appearances. In his world, shadows often hid knives. Inside the main building, the air conditioning hummed a steady rhythm, a stark contrast to the tension brewing outside. Jack passed through the processing area, nodding to officers as they handled intakes with practiced efficiency. At one desk, a young mother adjusted her toddler's shirt while an officer stamped her paperwork. At another, an elderly man spoke halting English, his hands trembling with hope. Jack's eyes softened for a moment. These were the people he'd sworn to protect, the ones who followed the rules and believed in the promise of a new life. But that softness vanished as Ethan waved him over to his station near the back, his fingers dancing across a keyboard as screens flickered with live feeds. "Boss, you need to see this," Ethis said, pushing his glasses up his nose as he pointed to a thermal scan of Sector 7.7. The heat signatures weren't random. They moved with a precision that screamed coordination, a dozen warm spots creeping through the desert terrain like wolves stalking prey. "Started about an hour ago, too organized for smugglers. I've been running analytics, but..." He trailed off, his brow furrowing. This feels like something bigger. Jack studied the screen, his jaw tightening. He'd seen patterns like this before. Afghanistan, Iraq, missions where the enemy played cat and mouse until the trap sprang. "How long have they been in Sector 7?" he asked, his voice low, the kind of calm that carried an edge sharper than steel. "Long enough to make me nervous," Ethan replied, his fingers pausing on the keys. "I'd say they're testing our blind spots." Jack nodded, his mind already mapping out scenarios. "Keep monitoring. Any change, you radio me immediately." He turned to leave, but not before catching a glimpse of Miguel and Sofia through the glass partition separating the tech hub from the processing area. Sofia's crayon scribbled a bright red flower on her paper, and Miguel's protective hand rested on her shoulder, a father's shield against an uncertain world. Jack's gut twisted. Whatever was coming, he'd be damned if it touched them. Back outside, the sun climbed higher, baking the cracked earth beneath Jack's boots. He adjusted his stance, favoring his left leg where an old shrapnel wound ached on days like this, a reminder of battles past and the cost of letting your guard down. His radio crackled again, this time with Officer Harris's voice from the south gate. "Commander, we've got a situation with a delivery truck. Papers say cleaning supplies, but the manifest doesn't match our orders." "On my way," Jack responded, his pace quickening as he headed toward the gate. The unease in his gut solidified into certainty. This wasn't just another day at the border. He passed a family approaching the processing center. A father with a weathered face, a mother clutching a baby wrapped in a faded blanket, and gave them a curt nod. "Welcome to the United States," he said, his tone softer than his expression. They returned hesitant smiles, unaware of the storm gathering just out of sight. At the south gate, Officer Harris stood beside a white delivery truck, his hand resting casually on his holster as he eyed the driver. A young man in a company uniform whose sweat-soaked shirt clung to his frame despite the morning chill. "Papers check out on the surface," Harris explained, handing Jack the clipboard. "But we don't have a delivery scheduled today." Jack approached the driver, his gaze steady and unyielding, the kind that could make a man confess sins he hadn't even committed. "Morning," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Mind if we take a look in the back?" The driver's hand twitched, a subtle tell Jack clocked instantly. "No problem, sir," the man stammered, his accent thick but practiced. "Just running late for other deliveries." "This won't take long," Jack assured him, though his eyes never left the man's face. He signaled Harris to start the inspection, his mind already racing through what they might find. A smuggling run? A decoy? Or something worse? The driver's anxiety was palpable now, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple as Harris yanked open the truck's rear doors. Inside, boxes were stacked with military precision, too neat, too perfect. Jack had seen setups like this before, coyotes hiding migrants in false walls, cartels stashing drugs in plain sight. He pulled out his phone and dialed Sheriff Linda Hayes. "Jack here. Could use your K9 unit for a routine check." As he awaited Linda's response, the radio crackled again. "Commander, it's Sarah. Ethan's got something else. We're seeing more movement in Sector 7. Looks like they're converging." Her voice carried a note of urgency that mirrored the tightening in Jack's chest. "Copy," he replied, his eyes still locked on the driver. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast. And Jack Sullivan, the man who'd walked through hell and back, wasn't about to let it breach his last line of defense. Not on his watch. Jack Sullivan stood at the south gate, his piercing blue eyes boring into the delivery truck driver as Officer Harris and two other agents began their inspection. The driver shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze darting toward the horizon as if expecting salvation or a signal. Jack's instincts, honed by decades in Delta Force, screamed that this wasn't a routine delivery gone wrong. The boxes in the truck were stacked too neatly, the labels too pristine, like a stage set for a play no one had rehearsed. He gripped the clipboard Harris had handed him, the paper crumpling slightly under his calloused fingers, and waited for Sheriff Linda Hayes' unit to arrive. But the air felt heavier now. charged with an unseen threat that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Harris tugged open the nearest box, revealing cleaning supplies, brooms, mops, bleach bottles, but Jack caught the faint gleam of something hidden beneath the top layer. "False bottom," he muttered under his breath, stepping closer. He pulled out his pocket knife and slit through the cardboard, revealing a compartment beneath. Empty. No drugs, no weapons, no migrants. Just a hollow space meticulously crafted to look innocuous. Jack's jaw tightened. This wasn't a smuggling run. It was a test, a cartel probing their defenses to see how thorough their inspections were. "They wanted to know how we'd react," he said to Harris, his voice low and edged with steel. "Keep this guy detained for questioning." Before Harris could respond, Jack's radio crackled with Ethan Brooks' urgent voice. "Commander, we've got a problem. 3 cameras on the western perimeter just went dark. Simultaneous failure. They're forming a triangle around a blind spot." Ethan's normally steady tone carried a tremor of unease, and Jack knew why. This wasn't a glitch. It was a calculated move, the kind he'd seen in ambushes from Kandahar to Mosul. Someone out there was orchestrating a strike, and they were playing for keeps. "Run a full diagnostic on those cameras," Jack ordered, his mind racing through tactical scenarios. "Get me satellite coverage of that sector, and don't let those patterns out of your sight." He turned back to the driver, whose face had gone pale despite the desert heat. "Who sent you?" Jack asked, his voice a quiet threat, the kind that made men spill secrets faster than bullets. The driver stammered something about a regular route, but Jack wasn't listening. His focus shifted inward, calculating the enemy's next move. Los Zetas didn't play games. They struck hard and fast. If they were behind this, the truck was just the opening act. Back at the command center, Jack strode in, his boots leaving faint trails of dust on the linoleum floor. Ethan's screens glowed with thermal imagery, the heat signatures in Sector 7 now forming a tighter cluster, moving with a precision that screamed military training. "They're not random," Ethan confirmed, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Looks like they've been at it for over an hour. I'd bet my next paycheck they're waiting for a signal." Jack nodded, his expression unreadable but his mind a storm of probabilities. "They're probing our defenses, testing how quick we respond. Los Zetas doesn't take this much interest in legal crossing points unless they've got something big planned." He tapped the screen where the heat signatures glowed like embers in the dark. "We need to slow them down, implement Operation Sandstorm, Phase 1, reverse the ventilation systems in the maintenance tunnels. Let's choke their approach with dust." Ethan hesitated for a split second, his brow furrowing. "That's a tight window, boss. If the wind shifts, it could blow back into the processing center." But Jack's gaze was unyielding, a silent command forged in the crucible of war. "Do it," he said. "We don't have time for clean plays." Ethan nodded, inputting the commands as the facility's hidden systems whirred to life, fans reversing with a low growl as they prepared to flood the tunnels with a maelstrom of desert sand and grit. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, its heat pressing down like a physical weight. Inside the processing center, the orderly hum of paperwork continued, oblivious to the gathering storm. Miguel Hernandez sat with Sofia, helping her color in the petals of a crimson flower on her scrap paper. "Like the roses Mama planted, right?" Sofia asked, her small voice bright despite the tension etched into her father's face. Miguel forced a smile, his fingers brushing the bracelet on his wrist, the one engraved with Clara's name. "Exactly like that, Mia," he murmured, though his eyes kept darting toward the uniformed officers, moving with a subtle urgency he couldn't ignore. The first sign of trouble came not with gunfire but with a faint tremor in the air, a low rumble from the ventilation ducts as Operation Sandstorm kicked in. Jack monitored the feeds from the command center, watching as dust began to swirl through the tunnels, the heat signatures scattering in response. But then Ethan's voice cut through the hum of the screens, sharp with panic. "Commander, it's backfiring. The wind's shifted. Dust is blowing into the civilian area." Jack's heart plummeted as he spun toward the live feed from the processing center. Thick gray clouds poured through the vents, turning the orderly room into a choking haze. Families coughed and panicked, officers shouting over the din as they tried to maintain calm. Through the chaos, Jack saw Sophia slip from Miguel's grasp, her tiny form vanishing into the smoke as she ran toward an open corridor near the maintenance tunnels, straight into the danger zone. "Damn it," Jack growled, snatching his radio as he bolted from the command center, ignoring the ache in his wounded leg and the fresh pain in his chest. "Sarah, get those vents shut down now. Ethan, track her on the cameras." He didn't wait for responses, his boots pounding against the floor as he raced toward the corridor, the dust stinging his eyes and throat. He couldn't let her reach the tunnels, not when Los Zetas might already be inside, waiting for a chance to strike. The corridor was a haze of gray, shadows flickering in the dim emergency lights. Jack's flashlight cut through the murk, his voice hoarse as he called out, "Sophia, stay where you are!" He heard a small sob to his left and turned just in time to see her silhouette dart around a corner toward the tunnel access point. He sprinted after her, his pulse hammering in his ears, and caught her frail form in his arms just as she stumbled near the sealed hatch. "Don't be scared, kiddo," Jack murmured, cradling her against his chest as her small body trembled. "I've got you. Promised I'd protect the whole world once, didn't I?" Sophia buried her face in his shoulder, her tiny fingers clutching his jacket as he turned to carry her back to safety. But the shadows moved. A figure emerging from the dust, a Los Zetas gunman with a silenced pistol leveled at Jack's back. Instinct took over. Jack twisted, shielding Sophia with his body as the gunshot rang out, a searing pain exploding in his left arm. Blood soaked through his sleeve, warm and wet, but he didn't falter, his free hand drawing his sidearm and firing back with deadly precision. The gunman dropped with a muted thud, his body swallowed by the swirling dust. Jack gritted his teeth against the pain, his vision blurring at the edges as he staggered back toward the processing center, Sophia still clutched tight in his grip. He emerged into the clearing haze, handing Sophia to a frantic Miguel, who fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he hugged his daughter. "Thank you," Miguel choked out, his voice raw with gratitude. "I thought I'd lost her. I thought I'd failed Clara." Jack managed a nod, his arm throbbing as blood dripped onto the floor, but his resolve hardened. This was his mistake. He'd underestimated the wind, and it had nearly cost a child her life. He wouldn't make the same error twice. Sarah rushed over, her face pale as she saw the blood. "Jack, you need medical." He cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. "Not now, we've got bigger problems." He turned to Ethan, who was still at his screens, his glasses reflecting the flickering feeds. "What else are they doing out there?" Ethan swallowed hard, his voice unsteady. "More movement in Sector 7, Commander. They're converging fast. Looks like they're ready to make their move." Jack's grip tightened on his radio, the pain in his arm fueling a fire in his chest. "Then we'll be ready for them," he growled, his wounded arm trembling but his resolve unshaken. "This is our line in the sand. No one crosses it." The haze of dust still lingered in the processing center, clinging to the air like a ghost of Jack Sullivan's earlier mistake. He leaned against the wall near the entrance, his left arm throbbing where the Los Zetas gunman's bullet had grazed him, blood seeping through the makeshift bandage Sarah Martinez had hastily wrapped around it. The pain was a dull roar in the back of his mind, but it paled against the fire in his chest. A mix of guilt and resolve that burned hotter with every glance at Sophia, now clinging to her father's side in the makeshift sanctuary of the facility's small chapel. Jack's boots had left bloody smudges on the linoleum floor, but he barely noticed. His focus was split between the fragile calm he'd restored and the storm he knew was gathering just beyond the perimeter. Inside the chapel, Father Daniel Rivera moved among the families with a quiet grace, his murmured prayers a steady anchor in the chaos. The wooden pews were filled with anxious faces, mothers clutching children, fathers staring at the walls as if expecting them to crumble. Miguel Hernandez sat near the front, Sophia curled against his chest, her crayons scattered on the pew beside her. The girl's small frame still trembled, but her father's arm around her was steady, a shield against the lingering fear. Miguel's other hand fidgeted with the bracelet on his wrist, the one engraved with Clara, a name that carried a weight Jack could feel even from across the room. Officer Harris lingered near the chapel entrance. His usually stoic expression softened as he watched Miguel. "He's been through hell, that one," Harris muttered to Jack, his voice low enough not to carry. "Told me a bit while you were out there playing hero. Said his wife died 3 years back. Los Zetas got her. She was a teacher, tried to stop them from recruiting kids at her school." Harris shook his head, his jaw tight. "They didn't take kindly to that. Made an example of her." Jack's gaze sharpened, though his face remained unreadable. "That why he's so jumpy?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. He'd seen it before. Men and women haunted by ghosts they couldn't outrun, carrying scars deeper than flesh. "Yeah," Harris replied. "Said she made him promise to get Sophia to the States, whatever it took. That bracelet, he keeps touching it like it's all he's got left of her." Harris's voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, glancing away as if embarrassed by the emotion. Jack didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on Miguel as the man brushed a strand of hair from Sophia's face. The chapel's dim light caught the tears glistening in Miguel's eyes, tears he tried to hide as he whispered something to his daughter. Jack turned away, a knot tightening in his chest. He understood promises forged in blood and loss. He'd made a few himself over the years, in deserts and jungles where the cost of failure was measured in lives. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about hope, the kind that kept a man like Miguel moving forward even when the world tried to break him. Father Rivera approached Miguel, kneeling beside him with a gentle smile. "You're safe here," the priest said softly, his voice a balm against the jagged edges of fear. "Both of you. God's watching over us, and so is Commander Sullivan." Miguel nodded, though his grip on Sophia tightened, as if he feared she might vanish again. "I thought I'd lost her," he whispered, his voice breaking. "When the smoke came, I thought I'd failed Clara. I swore to her I'd keep Sophia safe. I swore on her grave." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut, echoing through the chapel as he stood just outside the doorway. He clenched his good fist, the guilt from his tactical misstep clawing at him anew. He'd meant to slow the enemy, not endanger the very people he'd sworn to protect. But before he could dwell on it, his radio crackled with Ethan Brooks' voice, urgent and clipped. "Commander, we've got a problem in the comms logs. You need to see this now." Jack pushed off the wall, wincing as his wounded arm protested the movement. "On my way," he replied, casting one last glance at Miguel and Sophia before heading back to the command center. The chapel's stained glass windows glowed faintly in the morning light, a fragile beauty against the brewing storm outside. But beauty wouldn't stop bullets, or the kind of men Los Zetas sent to do their dirty work. Inside the command center, Ethan's screens cast a bluish glow across his tense face as he pulled up a series of encrypted logs. "Found this while running diagnostics on the camera outages," he said, his fingers trembling slightly as he pointed to a string of outgoing transmissions. "Someone's been sending data packets from inside the facility. Small bursts, but they're going to an untraceable channel. Started right before the truck showed up." He hesitated, his glasses slipping down his nose as he met Jack's gaze. "The signal traces back to Sarah's personal device." The air in the room seemed to thicken, the hum of the screen suddenly deafening. Jack's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, a storm brewing behind them as he processed the implications. Sarah Martinez, his deputy, his trusted second in command, had been with him through countless operations. She'd earned her stripes in Border Patrol, had a reputation for being unshakable, but now the evidence stared him in the face, stark and undeniable. "Get her in here," Jack said, his voice low but carrying a weight that made Ethan flinch. "Quietly. No one else hears about this until I say so." Ethan nodded, his hands shaking as he keyed the radio to summon Sarah. Jack's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. If Sarah was compromised, Los Zetas or whoever was pulling their strings had an inside line on their every move. The camera outages, the truck, the heat signatures. It all fit too neatly to be coincidence. Sarah entered the command center a minute later, her clipboard tucked under her arm as she offered Jack a tight smile. "You okay, boss? That arm looks bad. Dr. Carter should take a look." Her concern sounded genuine, but Jack wasn't in the mood for games. He stepped closer, his presence looming as he held up a printout of the comms log Ethan had flagged. "Explain this," he said, his tone colder than the desert night. "Your device, your code, data packets sent to an untraceable channel right before this whole mess started. You got something to tell me, Sarah?" Her face drained of color, the clipboard slipping slightly in her grip as her eyes darted to the printout. For a moment, silence stretched taut between them, the weight of betrayal hanging heavy in the air. Then her shoulders slumped, and her voice came out in a trembling whisper. "They've got my nephew Jack. Los Rojas. They said they'd kill him if I didn't give them anything critical, I swear, just enough to keep him alive." Jack's jaw clenched, his good hand curling into a fist as he fought the urge to slam it against the desk. Sarah's nephew, a kid barely 15, living with her sister across the border. He'd heard her talk about him, seen the photo she kept on her desk. But this was a line crossed, a trust shattered. "You should have come to me," he growled, his voice raw with barely contained anger. "You know what's at stake here. Those families out there, they're counting on us." "I know," Sarah said, tears glistening in her eyes as she met his gaze. "I'm sorry, Jack. I didn't know what else to do." She straightened, wiping her face with a shaky hand. "I'll turn in my badge if you want, but let me help fix this, please." The room fell silent again, the hum of Ethan's screens the only sound as Jack weighed his options. Every instinct screamed to bench her, to lock her down until he could sort this out. But Sarah knew their systems, their protocols. She was his best shot at plugging the leak before it sank them all. "You're staying," he said finally, his voice hard as granite. "But Ethan's watching every move you make. One wrong step, Sarah, and you're done. Understood?" She nodded, relief and shame warring across her features as she stepped back. Jack turned toward Ethan, his wounded arm throbbing in time with his heartbeat. "Lock down all outgoing comms," he ordered. "Delta 6 encryption only, and get me eyes on those heat signatures. Now." Ethan's screens flickered as he pulled up the latest thermal scans. The heat signatures in Sector 7 now a tight knot, moving closer to the facility with a predator's patience. "They're converging, Commander," Ethan said, his voice tight. "Looks like they're ready to hit us." Jack's gaze hardened, the pain in his arm fading against the surge of adrenaline. "Then we'll hit them first," he said, his voice a low growl as he prepared to draw his line in the sand, no matter the cost. Jack Sullivan stood in the command center, the faint hum of Ethan Brooks's screens a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his chest. His left arm ached where the bullet had torn through muscle, the makeshift bandage now a patchwork of dried blood and gauze. But he ignored it, his focus razor-sharp on the thermal scans flickering across the monitors. The heat signatures in Sector 7 had tightened into a predatory knot, their movements deliberate, closing in on the facility like a noose. Jack's jaw clenched as he glanced at Sarah Martinez, her face pale but resolute after her confession. The betrayal stung, but he'd made his call. She'd stay under watch, her knowledge of their systems too valuable to sideline now. The enemy was at their gates, and Jack wasn't about to let a crack in his team become a chasm. "Ethan, what's the latest on those signatures?" Jack asked, his voice a low growl as he leaned over the tech specialist's shoulder. Ethan's glasses reflected the glowing screen as his fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up updated scans. "They're holding position just outside engagement range," he replied, his voice tight. "But they're not retreating. Looks like they're waiting for something. Or someone." He hesitated, then added, "Could be Los Zetas, but this feels bigger, too coordinated." Jack nodded, his mind racing through possibilities. Los Zetas didn't play games. They struck hard and fast, often leaving carnage in their wake. But this methodical approach suggested a deeper game, one he'd seen in Special Forces ops gone rogue. "Keep eyes on them," he ordered, then turned to Sarah. "You got anything else on those comms leaks? Anything that tells us who they're talking to?" Sarah shook her head, her clipboard trembling slightly in her hands. "Not yet. I've locked down the channel I used. Ethan's got it sealed tight. But if Los Rojos are behind this, they've got more than one way to get intel." Her voice wavered, guilt etched into every word, but Jack didn't have time for reassurances. Trust might be fractured, but necessity demanded they move as a unit or fall apart. The tension in the room was palpable, a living thing that coiled around them as Jack weighed his options. They needed to buy time, disrupt the enemy's playbook before they could execute their next move. An idea took root, one born from the gray edges of morality he'd danced along in Delta Force ops. "Ethan," he said, his tone deceptively calm, "I need you to push a disinformation leak. Send it through unsecured channels. Make it look like a slip. Say we've found a cache of chemical weapons in the maintenance tunnels. Pin it to a fake report and let it hit the local news feeds." Ethan's fingers froze above the keyboard, his brow furrowing as he processed the order. "Chemical weapons? That'll stir up a hornet's nest. Cartels might panic, but so will civilians. Media's already sniffing around. Jessica Harper from Channel 5 keeps asking questions." He glanced at Jack, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "You sure about this, boss?" Jack's gaze didn't waver, though the weight of the decision pressed against him. "I'm sure we don't have time for clean plays," he replied, his voice steady but laced with an edge of steel. "If they think we've got something that dangerous, they'll hesitate, maybe even show their hand. We control the chaos, not them." Ethan nodded, though his expression remained uneasy, and began crafting the fake report, routing it through channels that would ensure it reached Jessica Harper's inbox within minutes. The disinformation worked faster than Jack expected. Within half an hour, Jessica's news van was parked just outside the facility's outer perimeter. Her voice crackling through a live broadcast, Ethan pulled up on one of his screens. "Reports are emerging of a possible chemical weapons cache discovered at the El Paso ICE facility," she announced, her tone urgent as the camera panned across the barbed wire fence. "Officials have yet to confirm, but the implications are staggering." Ethan muted the feed, his face pale. "It's working. They're spooked. Thermal scans show their team scattering, repositioning." But the victory was double-edged. Civilian chatter on the radio spiked, reports of locals gathering near the facility, drawn by fear and curiosity. Jack's gamble had rattled the enemy, but it had also stirred a hornet's nest of panic among the very people he'd sworn to protect. Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts, soft but urgent. "Jack, we're getting calls from the community. People are scared. If this gets out of hand—" She didn't finish, her eyes pleading for reassurance he couldn't give. "Handle it," Jack said, his tone clipped as he turned back to the screens. "Tell them it's under control. Standard procedure. Last thing we need is a mob at our gates." But even as he spoke, the weight of his decision gnawed at him. He'd played dirty to gain the upper hand, but at what cost? The question lingered, a shadow cast by the flickering light of Ethan's monitors as the first reports of cartel movement filtered through their channels. Los Zetas and Los Rojos both reacting, their scouts shifting positions as if caught off guard. Before Jack could dwell on the fallout, Ethan's voice sliced through the tension like a blade. "Commander, I've got something else. Radio chatter encrypted, but it's not Los Zetas. Picking up signals from a secondary team, moving toward a civilian area 5 miles out. Looks like a Los Rojos operation." His fingers flew across the keyboard, decrypting fragments of the transmission. "They're talking about a fallback plan, something big, explosives." Jack's blood ran cold, his wounded arm forgotten as he leaned over the screen studying the coordinates Ethan had pulled up. A local market bustling with early morning shoppers, families, kids. "Get me details," he snapped, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. "Now!" Sarah, who'd been listening intently, stepped forward with a tablet, pulling up intel from their detained insider, Juan Morales. Juan cracked under questioning, she said, her voice steady despite the strain in her eyes. Says Los Rojos have a contingency if they can't take the facility or get the evidence they want. They'll hit the market, detonate a load of C4 to create chaos, tie up law enforcement while they vanish in the fallout. They've got a team en route. ETA 20 minutes. The words hit Jack like a freight train, his pulse hammering as the room seemed to shrink around him. 20 minutes. Not enough time to evacuate a whole market. Not enough to stop an attack without splitting their already thin resources. His mind churned through options, each one uglier than the last. The facility was still under threat, Los Zetas circling like vultures, Los Rojos playing their own deadly game, but innocent lives hung in the balance 5 miles away, and he couldn't ignore that. Not after Sofia. Not after seeing the hope in Miguel's eyes. "Sarah, get Sheriff Linda Hayes on the line," Jack ordered, his voice a low growl as he straightened, ignoring the stab of pain in his arm. "Tell her to take a tactical unit to that market. FBI support if she can get it. They need to intercept that team before they can set charges. Non-lethal if possible, but no hesitation if it comes to it." Sarah nodded, her fingers already keying the radio as she relayed the orders with a precision that belied the guilt still etched into her features. Jack turned to Ethan, his expression hard as granite. "What we got left here? Manpower, defenses? Give me the rundown." Ethan swallowed, pulling up a roster on his screen. "We're at 60% capacity. Training rotation in El Paso took half our security team. 15 staff handling paperwork, 6 armed officers on site, including Harris. We're stretched thin, boss." "Thin or not, we hold this ground," Jack said, his voice unyielding as he adjusted his holster, the weight of his sidearm a cold comfort against the chaos piling up. "Los Zetas wants a fight, they'll get one. Los Rojos wants chaos, we'll give them order." But even as he spoke, the reality gnawed at him. Dividing their forces left them vulnerable, and with Sarah's betrayal still fresh, trust felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Outside, the midday heat shimmered across the facility grounds, the distant rumble of Jessica Harper's broadcast a faint echo through the open window. Inside, the command center buzzed with a tension that felt alive, coiling tighter with every passing second. Jack's gaze flicked to the live feed from the processing center, where families huddled in the chapel, Father Rivera's prayers a faint murmur through the walls. He saw Miguel holding Sofia close, the bracelet on his wrist catching the light, a reminder of the stakes they were fighting for. Ethan's voice broke the silence, urgent and sharp. "Commander, Los Zetas. They're moving in closer. Looks like they're done waiting. And Los Rojos, their market team just split off. We've got incoming on 2 fronts." Jack's grip tightened on his radio, the pain in his arm a distant echo against the surge of adrenaline. "Then we fight on 2 fronts," he said, his voice a low growl as he prepared to meet the storm head-on. "No one gets through." No one. The command center felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with tension and the acrid tang of Jack Sullivan's blood-soaked bandage. His left arm throbbed with every heartbeat, but his grip on the radio remained steady as Ethan Brooks's screens flickered with live feeds of the encroaching threats. Los Zetas teams edged closer to the facility's western perimeter, their movements a predatory dance illuminated by thermal scans, while Los Rojos' secondary unit had split off toward the civilian market 5 miles away. Jack's orders to Sheriff Linda Hayes had sent her team racing against time to intercept the explosives, but here at the facility, the storm was about to break. He glanced at Sarah Martinez, who stood rigid beside him, her face a mask of guilt and determination under Ethan's watchful eye. Trust was fractured, but necessity bound them together. For now. Outside, the midday heat shimmered across the cracked asphalt, distorting the distant shapes of Los Zetas' vehicles as they took up positions just outside clear engagement range. Inside the facility, the processing center had been transformed into a fortified safe zone. Non-essential personnel quietly evacuated to the chapel under Father Rivera's care. But the medical bay buzzed with a different kind of urgency. Director Emily Carter moved between 3 pregnant women, one of whom, Rosa, had slipped into early labor amidst the chaos, her contractions coming faster than expected. Emily's voice crackled through Jack's radio, sharp with concern. "Commander, Rosa's losing blood. She's not stable. We need to move her to a hospital now or we risk losing her and the baby." Jack's jaw tightened, his mind racing through the tactical nightmare unfolding around them. "Can you stabilize her long enough for a transport?" he asked, his voice steady despite the weight pressing against his chest. "We're working on an evac route, but it's hot out there." "I'll try," Emily replied, her tone clipped but focused. "But every minute counts. She's asking for her baby to be named Esperanza, Hope. If she doesn't make it..." The words hit Jack like a punch, a stark reminder of what was at stake beyond the gunfire and betrayal. He muttered a curt acknowledgement, then turned to Ethan. "Get me eyes on that western approach. Any sign they're breaching." Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up grainy feeds from the few remaining perimeter cameras. "They're holding for now, but wait, movement!" His voice spiked with alarm as 3 Los Zetas vehicles broke formation, speeding toward the facility's main gate under cover of the shimmering heat waves. "They're coming in hot, Commander." Jack didn't hesitate. "All units, execute Protocol Omega. Lock down the gates and man defensive positions," he barked into the radio, his wounded arm protesting as he grabbed his sidearm and moved toward the window overlooking the courtyard. Below, officers scrambled to their posts, their faces taut with determination as they braced for impact. But before the vehicles could reach the gate, a new threat erupted from the east. Los Rojos gunmen, led by Carlos Vega, emerged from concealed positions behind the commercial lot, their gunfire tearing through the silence like a thunderclap. Bullets slammed into the outer walls, not aimed to kill, but to sow chaos. A diversion Jack recognized instantly. "They're splitting our focus!" Sarah shouted, her clipboard forgotten as she drew her own weapon, her eyes darting between Jack and the screens. "Los Zetas at the front, Los Rojos on the flank. They're boxing us in." "Then we break the box," Jack growled, his mind a whirlwind of strategy as he keyed his radio again. "Harris, take 3 men and hold the east flank. Non-lethal if you can, but don't let them through. Sarah, coordinate with Emily. I want that evac route open for Rosa, no matter what." He turned to Ethan, his expression hard as granite. "Get me a path, any path, to get that ambulance out." Ethan nodded, sweating as he pulled up a map of the facility's service roads. "South gate's our best shot, but it's narrow, exposed on both sides. They'll have a clean shot if they've got snipers." Jack's gaze didn't waver. "They'll have to get through me first," he said, his voice a low rumble as he holstered his weapon and headed for the exit, ignoring Sarah's sharp intake of breath. The courtyard was a battlefield in miniature, the crack of gunfire echoing off the concrete walls as Los Rojos' diversionary attack forced Jack's team into a defensive sprawl. He moved low and fast, dodging behind a steel barricade as bullets ricocheted around him, his wounded arm screaming with every motion. Through the chaos, he saw the ambulance waiting near the medical bay, its red and white lights flashing like a beacon in the haze. Emily was inside with Rosa, her voice audible through the open door as she coached the young mother through another contraction. "Stay with me, Rosa. You're doing great," Emily said, her tone a mix of professionalism and raw urgency. But time was running out. Rosa's cries grew weaker, her breaths shallow as blood loss took its toll. Jack reached the ambulance just as Emily looked up, her face streaked with sweat. "She's fading, Jack. We can't wait." Before he could respond, a Los Rojos grenade soared through the air, landing with a dull thud 30 yards away. The explosion rocked the courtyard, its shockwave rattling the ambulance windows and sending a plume of dust skyward. Screams erupted from the chapel nearby, where families huddled under Father Rivera's watch, their prayers drowned out by the roar of violence. Jack's decision was instant, born from instinct and a refusal to let hope die on his watch. "Get her in! I'm driving," he shouted, hauling himself into the driver's seat as Emily secured Rosa's stretcher in the back. The engine roared to life, its growl a defiant answer to the gunfire outside. Jack slammed the accelerator, the ambulance lurching forward through the narrow south gate corridor, a gauntlet of exposed asphalt flanked by potential sniper nests. Bullets pinged off the armored sides, a Los Rojos marksman seizing the chance from a rooftop perch, but Jack kept his focus on the road, his knuckles white around the steering wheel as blood dripped from his arm onto the floor. Behind him, Rosa's voice came in a pained whisper between gasps. "Esperanza, promise me." Her words were cut off by a ragged cry, but Jack understood. "You'll both make it, Rosa," he shouted over his shoulder, his voice fierce with determination. "I'm not letting hope die today." He swerved to avoid a hail of gunfire, the ambulance shuddering as a tire took a glancing hit, a near miss that sent them skidding but not stopping. Through the chaos, Jack's radio crackled with Sheriff Linda Hayes's voice, breathless but steady. "Jack, we've got the market secured, explosives disarmed, but half the stalls are toast. No casualties, though." Relief flooded him, a brief lifeline in the storm, but it was short-lived. Ethan's voice broke through next, urgent and panicked. "Commander Los Rojos, they've breached the east fence. Harris is pinned down." Jack cursed under his breath, his gaze flicking to the rearview mirror where Emily worked frantically to stabilize Rosa. "Hold the line, Ethan. Reroute what's left of our team," he ordered, his voice a raw command as he pushed the ambulance through the final stretch of the corridor. The hospital loomed ahead, a sanctuary just out of reach. But the gunfire didn't relent. A Los Rojos sniper's bullet shattered the driver's side mirror, inches from Jack's head. Then, amidst the violence, a miracle cut through the darkness. Rosa's cries turned to a gasp of relief, followed by the piercing wail of a newborn. Esperanza born in the back of an ambulance under fire, her first breath a defiant act of life. Emily's voice trembled with awe as she radioed in. "She's here, Jack. Rosa's stable for now. We've got a fighter." Jack allowed himself a fleeting smile, the sound of that cry fueling his resolve as he floored the accelerator, tearing through the last stretch to the hospital gates. The ambulance screeched to a halt, medics rushing out to meet them as Jack stumbled from the driver's seat, his wounded arms slick with blood, but his mission fulfilled. Rosa's hand reached weakly for his as they wheeled her inside, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching her newborn daughter, "for giving her hope." Jack nodded, exhaustion and adrenaline warring in his veins as he watched them disappear into the hospital, but his moment of respite shattered with Ethan's next transmission. "Commander, we've got confirmation. They've stolen a file from the evidence vault during the chaos. Classified intel, offshore accounts, cartel payoffs. It's bad." Jack's grip tightened on the radio, the weight of two fronts crashing down around him. Hope had survived, but at what cost? Jack Sullivan leaned against the hospital entrance, his blood-soaked sleeve sticking to his wounded arm as the adrenaline drained from his body like water through a cracked dam. The distant wail of sirens mingled with the fading echo of Esperanza's first cry, a sound that had cut through the gunfire and chaos, anchoring him in a moment of raw, unyielding hope. Rosa and her newborn were safe inside, medics swarming around them with practiced efficiency, but Jack's mind was already racing back to the facility. Ethan's last transmission gnawed at him, a classified file stolen from the evidence vault during Los Rojos' diversion, its contents a ticking bomb of offshore accounts and cartel payoffs that could unravel years of anti-corruption work. The victory of getting Rosa to safety felt hollow against the shadow of that loss. He pressed the radio to his ear, his voice roughened by dust and fatigue. "Ethan, talk to me. What's the status at the facility? Any sign of Harris or the east flank?" The crackle of static stretched for a heartbeat too long before Ethan's voice came through, tense but steady. "Harris is holding but barely. Los Rojos pinned him down near the fence. Los Zetas are pulling back though. Something's off, Commander. Their leader, Diego Navarro, he's signaling for a parley, wants to talk." Jax's brow furrowed, suspicion coiling in his gut like a snake. Diego Navarro, the ex-military turned cartel lieutenant, wasn't known for talking, not unless it served his endgame. "A parley?" Jack repeated, his tone sharp as a blade. He's got half his men shooting at us, and now he wants a chat? Where's he at? Main gate, Ethan replied, his voice tinged with unease. He's alone, unarmed from what we can see, waving a white rag like he's in some old war movie. Orders? Jack's gaze flickered to the hospital doors, where Rosa's stretcher had disappeared, then back to the cracked pavement beneath his boots. Every instinct screamed trap, but he'd seen men like Diego before, soldiers turned criminals, clinging to fragments of honor even in the mire of their choices. Tell Harris to hold the east flank. No heroics, he said finally. I'm heading back. Get Sarah on the external speakers. I'll hear what Navarra has to say, but I'm not taking chances. The drive back to the facility was a blur of flashing lights and gritted teeth, Jack's wounded arm burning with every turn of the wheel. He'd commandeered an ICE patrol car from the hospital lot, its engine growling as he pushed it to its limits. The border post loomed ahead, its barbed wire glinting in the harsh midday sun, a fortress under siege yet still standing. Jack parked just inside the south gate, his sidearm a cold weight against his hip as he strode toward the main entrance, where Diego Navarro stood flanked by two of Jack's armed officers, both with rifles trained on the man's chest. Diego cut an imposing figure despite his lack of weapons, his tailored suit dust-streaked but intact, his posture straight as a blade. A former Mexican Special Forces officer, his dark eyes carried the weight of a man who'd seen too much blood to flinch at it now. But there was something else there, a flicker of something Jack couldn't quite place. Regret? Resignation? Diego raised his hands slowly, the white rag dangling from his fingers like a truce flag from another era. "Commander Sullivan," he called, his voice carrying over the hum of distant gunfire. "We need to talk." Jack stopped 10 feet away, his gaze unyielding as he crossed his good arm over his chest. "You've got a funny way of starting a conversation, Navarro," he said, his tone cold as the desert night. "Your men are still shooting at mine. Give me one reason I shouldn't have you in cuffs right now." Diego's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile that held no warmth. "Because I'm calling them off," he replied, his voice steady despite the rifles aimed at him. He pulled a radio from his belt, slow and deliberate, and keyed it with a single command in rapid Spanish. Jack didn't need Sarah's translation to know what it meant. The gunfire from Los Zetas positions tapered off, silence settling over the facility like a held breath. Diego tossed the radio to the ground, his hands returning to the air. "That reason enough for you?" Jack didn't relax, but he nodded for Sarah to activate the external speakers, keeping Diego in his line of sight. "Say your piece," he said, his voice echoing through the courtyard, "and make it quick. I've got people bleeding because of you." Diego's gaze didn't waver, though a shadow crossed his face as he spoke. "This wasn't about taking your facility, Sullivan. Not really. Los Rojos? They played us both. Carlos Vega's been after the same intel you're missing. Offshore accounts, names of officials we've both got dirt on. My orders were to distract you while they stole it. But I'm done playing pawn in their game." He paused, his voice lowering as if the words cost him something. "I've got a son, you know, back in Juarez. Didn't sign up for this life so he'd grow up thinking his father only knew how to kill." The admission landed like a grenade in Jack's chest, though his expression didn't change. He'd heard sob stories from men like Diego before, cartel lieutenants spinning tales to save their hides, but there was a rawness in Diego's tone, a fracture in the facade that made Jack pause. "You expect me to believe you're turning saint now?" he asked, his voice edged with skepticism. "After all the blood on your hands?" Diego's eyes darkened, but he didn't flinch. "Not a saint," he said quietly, "just a soldier who got pushed too far down the wrong road. I worked with the Mexican government once, fed them intel to take down bigger fish than me. They promised me protection, a way out, then they burned me, left my sister dead in a ditch to send a message. Los Zetas was my only play after that, but I draw the line at letting Vega turn this into a bloodbath for profit." He gestured toward the ambulance bay where Jack had just risked his life for Rosa. You fought for your people today, let me fight for mine, starting with getting the rest of your ambulances out. Jack studied him, searching for a lie in the man's steady gaze. Every instinct screamed caution, but there was a practicality in Diego's words, a soldier's logic that resonated with Jack's own. "What's your angle?" he asked, his voice low but carrying over the speakers. "You don't strike me as the self-sacrificing type." "No angle," Diego replied, his tone firm. "Just a trade. I give you intel on where Vega's taking that file, offshore contacts, drop points, the works. In return, you let me walk long enough to settle my score with him, then you can cuff me, lock me up, I won't fight it." The offer hung in the air, a gamble wrapped in shadows. Jack's mind churned through the risks. Letting Diego go could backfire, but the intel might be the only way to recover the stolen file before it disappeared into the cartel underworld. He keyed his radio, keeping his eyes on Diego. "Sarah, get Agent Laura Bennett on the line. I want FBI ears on this. Ethan, verify what you can of his story. If he's playing us, I want to know before he steps 1 foot out of here." Diego stood motionless, his hands still raised as Jack's team scrambled to confirm his claims. Minutes stretched, taut, the silence broken only by the faint hum of Jessica Harper's news van in the distance, her broadcast still fueling civilian unrest outside the perimeter. Finally, Laura's voice crackled through the radio, her tone clipped but professional. "Commander, DEA files match parts of his story. Navarro was on their payroll as an informant until things went south 3 years ago. He's dirty, but he's got history with Vega. Bad blood, looks like." Jack's gaze never left Diego's face as he weighed the intel against instinct. "All right, Navarro," he said at last, his voice a low growl. "You've got a deal, for now. But you step out of line, and I'll bury you myself. Clear?" Diego nodded, a flicker of relief or resignation crossing his features. "Clear," he said, lowering his hands as Jack's officers stepped back, rifles still at the ready. "Vega's got a safe house in Reynosa, crosses the border tonight. I'll get you the coordinates. But Sullivan, watch your back. Los Rojos aren't done playing dirty." Jack didn't respond, his mind already spinning toward the next move as he turned to Sarah. "Get those ambulances moving, use Navarro's ceasefire while it lasts, and tell Laura to prep attack team. We're hunting Vega." But as he watched Diego walk away under escort, a question lingered, heavy as the blood drying on his arm. Was Navarro's redemption real, or just another cartel game? Jack Sullivan stood just outside the facility's main gate, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the barbed wire as the distant wail of sirens faded into a tense calm. His left arm hung heavy at his side, the blood-soaked bandage a grim reminder of the day's cost, but the fire in his chest burned brighter than the pain. Diego Navarro's ceasefire had held, barely, allowing the remaining ambulances to ferry their precious cargo to safety, mothers and newborns now under the care of hospital staff. But the stolen file from the evidence vault gnawed at Jack like a splinter under his skin, its contents a Pandora's box of corruption that could unravel far more than just this border post. As he watched the last of Navarro's men surrender their weapons to Agent Laura Bennett's FBI team, Jack knew the fight was far from over. Inside the command center, Ethan Brooks hunched over his screens, his fingers a blur as he decrypted fragments of intel Navarro had provided before disappearing into custody. "Safe house in Reynosa," Ethan muttered, pushing his glasses up his nose as he cross-referenced coordinates with satellite imagery. Navarro wasn't lying. Vega's headed there with the file. Offshore accounts, names of crooked officials on both sides of the border, even some U.S. politicos tied to cartel payoffs. It's a damn gold mine for Los Rojos if they sell it to the right buyer. He glanced at Jack, his face pale but determined. "Laura's got her team prepped. They're moving out in 20. Jack nodded, his jaw tight as he processed the scope of the leak. "What about the facility? Any fallout from Los Rojos' breach?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with fatigue. Ethan hesitated, then pulled up a grainy feed from the east fence. Harris's team had held the line, but not without cost. 2 officers had taken minor shrapnel wounds from a Los Rojos grenade meant to cover their escape, and the evidence vault door bore the scars of a failed secondary attempt to crack it. "We're secure for now," Ethan said, "but that file's already out there. I'm picking up chatter. Someone leaked a chunk of it online. It's going viral." The words hit Jack like a sucker punch, his good hand tightening into a fist as he absorbed the implications. The file wasn't just a list of dirty deals, it was a map of corruption spanning 3 states and 2 countries, implicating everyone from local sheriffs to federal agents. If it spread unchecked, it could spark chaos, riots, reprisals, or worse, a power vacuum for cartels to exploit. "Trace the leak," Jack ordered, his tone sharp as a blade. "Find out who's spreading it and where it's landing. We need to control the narrative before this blows up in our faces." Sarah Martinez stepped forward, her expression a mix of guilt and resolve as she handed Jack a tablet with real-time updates. "I've got calls coming in from Washington. DOJ's freaking out about the leak," she said, her voice steady despite the strain in her eyes. "They're saying it's already hitting dark web forums. Cartels are scrambling to cover their tracks, but so are the officials named in it. It's a mess, Jack." She hesitated, then added, "And Jessica Harper's still out there, stirring the pot. Her latest broadcast is calling you a hero for saving Rosa. But she's also questioning the chemical weapons hoax. People are starting to ask if we hid the truth to justify the violence." Jack's gaze darkened, the fallout from his disinformation gambit cutting deeper than he'd expected. He'd meant to rattle the enemy, not fracture public trust. But the line between necessity and ethics had blurred in the heat of battle. "Get Harper on comms," he said, his voice low but unyielding. "I'll set the record straight myself. No more shadows. We play this clean from here on out." The impromptu press conference was set up on the courthouse steps, a mile from the facility, Jessica Harper's camera crew scrambling to catch Jack's words as he faced the lens, his bloodied uniform and unyielding stance painting a picture of defiance. "There were no chemical weapons," he admitted, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the small crowd gathered around. "It was a calculated leak, a tactic to disrupt the cartel's plans and protect innocent lives. I take full responsibility for any fear it caused, but I'd do it again if it meant saving the families inside that facility." He paused, his gaze steady as he met Jessica's eyes through the camera. "We stopped 2 attacks today, 1 here, 1 at your local market. That's the truth. Hold me accountable for the rest." The broadcast rippled through the community like a shockwave, splitting opinions down the middle. Some hailed Jack as a hero, a Delta Force veteran who'd put his life on the line to protect their borders. Others condemned him for playing fast and loose with the truth, arguing that fear outweighed the ends he'd achieved. Online forums buzzed with debate, hashtags like Sullivan Hero and Border Lies trending in equal measure. A storm Jack knew he'd have to weather, but one he'd face head-on. Back at the facility, the chapel had become a sanctuary of a different kind. Its pews filled with families now sharing stories of survival and loss under Father Rivera's gentle guidance. Miguel Hernandez sat at the forefront, Sofia asleep in his lap as he spoke to a small group, his voice trembling but resolute. "I lost everything to Los Zetas," he said, his fingers brushing the bracelet engraved with Clara's name. "My wife, she died so kids in our town could have a chance. Coming here, I thought I'd fail her again. But Commander Sullivan," his voice broke, tears glistening in his eyes as he clutched Sofia tighter. "He gave us a future. We owe him more than we can repay." Father Rivera placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder, his eyes warm with compassion. "You're not alone in this," he said softly, gesturing to the families around them. "Look at what you've all endured and survived. That's the strength of community, of faith. We'll stand together now." The words sparked a murmur of agreement, voices rising as others shared their own tales of fleeing cartel violence, of clinging to hope in the face of despair. The chapel hummed with a quiet resolve, a gathering storm of courage that Jack felt even from outside its walls. Inside the command center, Jack reviewed Ethan's latest updates on the leaked file. "It's spreading fast," Ethan reported, his glasses fogging slightly as he wiped sweat from his brow. "But it's also backfiring. Some of the named officials are turning themselves in before their agencies can move on them. DOJ's scrambling to verify what's real and what's noise." He paused, pulling up a grainy image from a dark web forum. "And this? Someone claiming to be Los Rojos posted it. Looks like a manifesto, blaming Vega for failing to secure the file cleanly." Jack's gaze narrowed, his mind piecing together the implications. "They're fracturing," he said, more to himself than Ethan. "Vega's got enemies in his own ranks. Someone's looking to take his place." He turned to Sarah, who'd been coordinating with Laura's team in Reynosa. "What's the word from Bennett?" "They raided the safe house 10 minutes ago," Sarah replied, her tablet glowing with live updates. "Vega wasn't there, slipped out before they arrived, but they recovered the file, or at least part of it. Looks like he made copies, though. Laura's team is tracing leads on where he might have sent them." Jack nodded, his expression unreadable, but his mind a storm of strategy. The file's recovery was a win, but Vega's escape meant the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. He keyed his radio, his voice steady despite the exhaustion creeping into his bones. "Laura, good work. Keep digging. Vega's not the type to run without a plan. And get me everything you can on those dark web leaks. I want to know who's behind them." As he set the radio down, Emily Carter's voice came through the secure line, soft but brimming with relief. "Jack, all 3 mothers and their babies are stable. Rosa named her girl Esperanza. She's asking for you to visit when things settle." The words brought a faint smile to Jack's lips, a flicker of warmth in the cold aftermath of battle. Esperanza? Hope. A fitting name for a child born in the crucible of chaos. Outside, the community's response grew louder, voices rising in support as Miguel and other families shared their stories with Jessica Harper's crew. The chapel became a rallying point, a beacon of resilience that drew in local leaders and activists, their calls for justice echoing through the facility's halls. Jack watched through the command center window, his wounded arm throbbing in time with his heartbeat, but his resolve unshaken. The truth had cost him trust, blood, maybe more, but it had also forged something stronger, a community united, ready to stand against the shadows. Ethan's voice broke through his thoughts, urgent and sharp. "Commander, we've got new chatter. Someone claiming to have a copy of the file just contacted DOJ. They're demanding immunity in exchange for handing it over." Jack's gaze hardened, the flicker of hope replaced by the cold steel of duty. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Jack Sullivan stood at the facility's main gate, the early morning sun casting a golden glow across the El Paso skyline, its warmth a quiet balm against the scars of the past month. The barbed wire atop the fence gleamed like a crown of thorns, a reminder of the battle fought and barely won, but Jack's gaze was softer now, his blue eyes tracing the steady stream of new families approaching the processing center, hopeful faces clutching worn documents, dreams stitched into every. His left arm bore a fresh scar where the bullet had torn through, a jagged line faded pink against his tan skin, but the ache had dulled to a faint whisper beneath his sleeve. He adjusted his commander's insignia, the weight of it heavier now with the lessons carved into his bones, and took a deep breath of crisp desert air. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in weeks, he felt the tide turning toward something brighter. Inside the processing center, the hum of paperwork and murmured conversations filled the air, a steady rhythm of normalcy restored. Miguel Hernandez sat at a desk near the front, Sofia perched on his lap, as an officer stamped their final documents, green cards, a ticket to a new life free from the shadows of Los Zetas. Miguel's fingers brushed the bracelet on his wrist, the one engraved with Clara, and a faint smile tugged at his lips as he whispered to Sofia, "We made it, Mija, like Mama always wanted." Across the room, other families shared similar moments of quiet triumph, parents embracing children, elderly couples holding hands with tears in their eyes, all bound by the shared resilience forged in the crucible of that hellish day. Jack watched from the courtyard, his heart swelling with a pride he couldn't quite name, though the weight of what had been lost lingered like a shadow at the edges. The facility had become a beacon in the weeks since the siege, its defiance rippling through communities on both sides of the border. Ethan Brooks's screens now glowed with updates from DOJ and FBI task forces, their investigations into the leaked file exposing a sprawling network of corruption. 28 state and federal officials indicted, 15 high-ranking cartel leaders named in sealed warrants, and 3 major trafficking routes dismantled in coordinated raids. The dark web leak had backfired on Los Rojos, sparking internal chaos as Carlos Vega's own men turned on him, their manifesto online a desperate bid to save themselves. Vega himself remained a ghost, last spotted crossing into Guatemala with what remained of the file's copies, but Laura Bennett's team was closing in. Their pursuit relentless as the intel Navarro had provided bore fruit. Jack's decision to leak the chemical weapons hoax had left its own scars. Public trust had wavered in the immediate aftermath, with forums and local editorials split between hailing him as a hero and branding him a manipulator. But the community's response had shifted the narrative in the weeks since, their voices drowning out the skeptics with stories of survival and gratitude. Miguel had taken to organizing community meetings at the chapel, his teacher's instincts kicking in as he rallied other families to speak out, first at Father Rivera's gatherings, then on Jessica Harper's broadcasts. Commander Sullivan didn't just save us, Miguel had told a crowd on Channel 5, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. He gave us a voice. We won't be silent anymore. The chapel itself had transformed into a hub of resilience, its stained glass windows glowing with candlelight during evening vigils where families shared their stories. Tales of loss, of fleeing cartel violence, of clinging to hope in the face of despair. Father Rivera stood at the forefront, his prayers a steady anchor as local leaders joined in, their plans for advocacy groups and crossbred coalitions taking shape. Jack had watched one such meeting from the back pew, unnoticed, as Sophia presented a drawing of a red flower to a new family, her small voice bright with encouragement. "It's like Mama's roses," she'd said, and the words had nearly undone him, a lump rising in his throat as he slipped out before anyone could see the moisture in his eyes. Inside the command center, Sarah Martinez handed Jack a letter as he reviewed the latest DOJ briefs. "Came this morning," she said, her tone softer now, the guilt that had once shadowed her features replaced by a quiet resolve. "From Navarro. In prison." Jack took the envelope, his fingers brushing the rough paper as he tore it open. The note inside was brief, written in a steady hand. "I was wrong, Sullivan, but I chose right in the end. Thanks for giving me that chance." Jack set the letter down, his expression unreadable but his mind heavy with questions. Navarro's intel had helped, there was no denying that. But redemption was a murky thing, and Jack wasn't sure if he'd ever fully trust the man's motives. The fallout from the leaked file continued to spread, its contents a double-edged sword that cut through corruption but left new wounds in its wake. Ethan's latest report showed a second copy surfacing on a dark web auction, the anonymous seller demanding a fortune in cryptocurrency or immunity from federal charges. DOJ had scrambled to suppress it, but whispers of its existence stirred unease in Washington, hinting at a larger storm brewing beyond Jack's immediate horizon. "They're playing a long game," Ethan muttered, pushing his glasses up his nose as he scanned the chatter. "Someone out there wants this to keep burning, maybe to take Vega's place, maybe to bury someone else." Jack nodded, filing the information away as he stepped outside, the morning sun warming his face as he walked the perimeter fence. The facility stood firm, its scars, bullet holes in the walls, a scorched patch near the east gate, proof of what it had endured. But it was stronger now, its protocols tightened, its staff more vigilant, its purpose clearer. Jack paused at the main gate, watching a new family approach, a father with a weathered face, a mother clutching a baby wrapped in a faded blanket. "Welcome to the United States," he said, his tone softer than his weathered exterior suggested. and the hesitant smiles they returned felt like a small victory against the darkness. Emily Carter's voice crackled through his radio as he turned back toward the command center, her tone warm with news that lifted the weight from his shoulders. "Jack, Rosa's asking for you again. Esperanza's thriving, by the way. They're naming a community health program after her. Hope's Start, they're calling it." The words brought a rare smile to Jack's lips, a flicker of the man beneath the soldier's armor. Esperanza, a name that had carried them through the fire, was now a symbol of something greater, a spark that could light the way for others. But as Jack reached his office, a final report from Laura Bennett cast a shadow over the morning's promise. "We intercepted chatter," someone claiming to have another copy of the file just reached out to Vega's old contacts, she said, her voice taut with urgency. "They're planning to auction it internationally. Could be a bluff, could be real. Either way, it's not over." Jack set the radio down, his gaze drifting to the horizon where storm clouds gathered in the distance, a mirror to the uncertainty stirring in his gut. He leaned against the window, the weight of his insignia heavier now with the choices still ahead. The facility stood as a testament to what they'd achieved, hope forged in fire, a community united against the shadows. But the fight was far from finished. Jack's eyes narrowed, his scarred hand flexing as he steeled himself for what might come. The American dream he'd sworn to protect wasn't safe yet. Not while men like Vega lurked in the dark, not while corruption's roots ran deep. But as he watched another family pass through the gate, their faces alight with possibility, he knew one thing for certain: he'd stand his ground no matter the cost.